Miss Marple and the Secret of the Frozen Lake, Chapter 1, The Winter Party at Thornbury. Hall. The January chill had transformed the small village of Thornbury Magna into a Victorian scene. Slate roofs gleamed under a layer of frost, and the lake bordering the Ashworth estate had frozen over for the first time in 15 years. It was an extraordinary enough event that the widowed Helena Ashworth decided to hold an ice skating party. The first at Thornbury Hall since her husband's death 3 years earlier. Miss Jane Marple watched from the front room window as the guests gathered by the lake. She had arrived in the village 2 days earlier, invited by her old friend Dolly Bantry, who was a distant cousin of the hostess. In her 80s, Miss Marple no longer skated, but she found particular pleasure in watching others do so. "It's lovely, isn't it?" Dolly remarked, approaching with 2 mugs of hot chocolate. "Helena's done a magnificent job organizing all this. Although, between us, I think she has ulterior motives." Miss Marple accepted the cup with a kind smile. "Underlying motives, my dear. Her son, Geoffrey. He just turned 35 and is still single. Helena is desperate to see him married before she... Well, you know, the doctors don't give her more than a year." Miss Marple turned her gaze towards the lake, where a tall, dark-haired young man was skating gracefully beside a delicate-looking blonde woman. Geoffrey Ashworth, presumably one of the candidates selected by her mother. "The young blonde is Margot Sinclair," Dolly explained, following her gaze. "Daughter of a London banker. New money, but plenty of it. And the brunette, who just arrived, the one in the red coat, is Penelope Hartington. Old family, properties in Devonshire, but practically bankrupt." "How interesting," murmured Miss Marple, in the garden. Other guests had gathered around a table where hot punch was being served. Reverend Thomas Whitmore was conversing animatedly with Dr. Edmund Price, the village doctor, while his wife, a nervous woman named Clara, watched the skaters with an anxious expression. Nearby, a portly man with ruddy cheeks smoked a cigar with an air of satisfaction. It was Victor Crane, the manager of the Ashworth estate for the past 2 decades. Victor knew the late Mr. Ashworth from university. Dolly whispered, "They say he was the one who convinced Helena not to sell the property after the funeral. Of course, he'd lose his job if he did." Miss Marple noticed Victor Crane watching Geoffrey with an expression that wasn't entirely friendly. A flicker of something, resentment perhaps, before his face regained its usual cheerfulness. Helena Ashworth's arrival in the drawing room interrupted his observations. She was a 60-year-old woman, thin to the point of frailty, but with bright eyes that belied her illness. "Miss Marple, what a joy that you could come. Dolly has told me so much about you. It's very kind of you to invite me." "Mrs. Ashworth, your home is lovely." Helena smiled, but there was tension at the corners of her lips. "Please call me Helena, and I hope you enjoy the party, though I fear it's not all as idyllic as it seems." She lowered her voice. "I've had the strangest feeling lately, like someone's watching me, like something terrible is about to happen." Before Miss Marple could reply, a sharp scream pierced the winter air. The 3 women turned toward the window. On the lake, the skaters had stopped, forming an irregular circle around something. Someone shouted again, and this time Miss Marple recognized Margot Sinclair's voice. "Oh my God!" exclaimed Dolly. "What's happened?" Helena was already running towards the door, moving with surprising agility for someone in her condition. Miss Marple and Dolly followed her, though at a considerably slower pace. By the time they reached the edge of the lake, Dr. Price had already made his way through the crowd. Geoffrey Ashworth held Margot, who was sobbing, against his shoulder. Penelope Hartington stood motionless, her face as white as the snow that covered the nearby bushes. "What's happening?" Helena asked, her voice trembling. Reverend Whitmore turned to her, his face ashen. It's Victor. He's under the ice." Miss Marple approached cautiously, her shoes crunching on the frost. Through a section of the lake where the ice was thinner, almost transparent, she could see the dark shape of a body suspended in the icy water. Victor Crane's eyes were open, staring upward through his crystalline prison, and his face wore an expression of utter terror. "The ice gave way," someone murmured. She must have skated too close to the center. But Miss Marple had noticed something that everyone else seemed to have missed. Victor Crane wasn't wearing skates. His dress shoes, perfectly visible through the ice. Chapter 2. The people react. The news of Victor Crane's death spread through Thornbury Magna like wildfire. By tea time, there wasn't a single house in the village where the tragic event wasn't being discussed, and the theories about what had happened were as varied as the people who put them forward. Inspector Arthur Hewitt arrived from Much Benham Police Station shortly after 4 in the afternoon, accompanied by Sergeant Peters, a young man with a perpetually confused expression. Hewitt was a seasoned officer, stern-faced and brusque in manner, who had solved several cases in the region efficiently, if not with particular finesse. "An unfortunate accident," he declared after briefly examining the scene. The ice gave way under his weight. "These lakes are treacherous in winter." Miss Marple, who had remained discreetly in the background while the police worked, allowed herself a small cough. "Excuse me, Inspector, but don't you find it odd that Mr. Crane wasn't wearing skates?" Hewitt looked at her with that condescending expression that men of a certain age reserved for nosy old women. He probably went out to check the thickness of the ice. He was the estate manager, after all. It was his responsibility to make sure the guests were safe. "Of course," Miss Marple replied sweetly. "How silly of me not to have thought of it." But her blue eyes, clear as spring water, remained thoughtful as she watched the men work to retrieve the body from the lake in the drawing room of Thornbury Hall. The guests had gathered in small groups, speaking in agitated whispers. Helena Ashworth had been taken to her room by Dr. Price, who administered a mild sedative. Geoffrey stood by the fireplace, his face grim, rejecting Margot Sinclair's attempts to comfort him. "Victor was like an uncle to me," he said hoarsely. "He knew my father before I was born. I can't believe he's gone." Penelope Hartington, sitting in a secluded corner, watched the scene with an unreadable expression. Miss Marple noticed that her hands, folded in her lap, were trembling slightly. "How awful," Dolly Bantry remarked, approaching her friend. "Poor Victor. Although I must say, I never particularly liked him. There was something about him, I don't know how to explain it. Something fake. False, darling. Oh, you know. Always smiling, always helpful, but his eyes never smiled with him. He reminded me of Mr. Hodges. Remember him? The butcher from St. Mary Mead who turned out to be swindling half the village." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. She remembered Mr. Hodges very well, and the comparison was interesting. Mrs. Clara Price approached them, wringing her hands with her usual nervousness. "It's terrible, just terrible. Edmund says she probably died of hypothermia before she drowned. The water was so cold that..." She shuddered. "I can't stop thinking about it." "Did your husband examine the body?" Miss Marple asked. "Only briefly, before the police arrived. He said there was something strange going on, but Inspector Hewitt wouldn't listen. You know how these small-town cops are. They think they know everything. Before Miss Marple could ask what the doctor had found odd, Reverend Whitmore joined the group. His normally ruddy face was pale, and his hands trembled as he accepted a cup of tea. "I've been thinking," she said quietly, "that perhaps Victor had something on his mind. Something that was deeply troubling him." "What do you mean, Reverend?" Dolly asked. "He came to see me 3 days ago. He wanted to talk, but when the time came, he seemed to change his mind. He just said that there were things from the past that sometimes come back to haunt us. I thought he was speaking in spiritual terms, but now I wonder if he meant something more concrete." Miss Marple filed this information carefully in her mind, along with the detail of the shoes and the expression of terror on the deceased's face that night. While the village slept restlessly, she lay awake in her guest room, knitting and thinking. The fire crackled softly in the fireplace, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Victor Crane had died in the lake, but he hadn't gone there of his own free will. Of that she was certain. A man of his size and age wouldn't venture onto thin ice without a compelling reason, and the expression on his face, that absolute terror frozen forever, suggested that he had seen something or someone. In his final moments, what secrets from the past had returned to haunt him? And who, in this quiet English village, had a motive to silence him permanently? Miss Marple laid down her knitting and went to the window. From there she could see the lake, a dark patch in the moonlight, now cordoned off with police tape. Somewhere in Thornbury Hall, someone else was probably awake, wondering whether their secret would die with Victor Crane, or whether, like so many buried things, it would eventually surface. The January wind whispered through the bare trees, and Miss Marple was certain that this was only the beginning. Chapter 3. Silent Observations. The next morning dawned grey and threatening, with low clouds that promised more snow. Miss Marple went down to the dining room at 8 o'clock, finding it almost empty. Only Penelope Hartington was there, sitting by the window with an untouched cup of tea before her. "Good morning, my dear," Miss Marple greeted, taking a piece of toast from the sideboard. "Did you sleep well?" Penelope jumped as if she had been caught in the middle of a forbidden thought. "Oh, Miss Marple, I didn't hear you come in." "No, I'm afraid I haven't slept much. Yesterday's events were disturbing." Miss Marple sat down opposite her, spreading bitter orange marmalade on her toast with precise movements. "I completely understand. Death is always unsettling, especially when it happens so unexpectedly." Penelope nodded, but her eyes avoided the old woman's. There were dark circles under her eyelids, and her fingers drummed nervously against the porcelain of the cup. "Did you know Mr. Crane well?" Miss Marple asked casually. "Not really. I mean, I'd seen him a few times when I visited Thornbury Hall. Helena and my mother were friends before Mum passed away." She paused. "Victor was always very kind to me." There was something about the way he pronounced the word kind that made Miss Marple tilt her head slightly. It was the same tone Mrs. Finch of St. Mary Mead used when describing the postman's kindness. Kindness that turned out to be considerably less innocent than it appeared, before the conversation could continue. Geoffrey Ashworth entered the dining room. He looked as if he hadn't slept at all, with a wrinkled shirt and dishevelled hair. "Miss Marple, Miss Hartington," he greeted her briefly before pouring himself some black coffee. "The police will be back this morning. They want to question everyone who was there yesterday." "Have they determined the cause of death?" Penelope asked. "Officially, accidental drowning, but my mother insists there's more to it. She's been talking to the inspector all night, demanding a full investigation. Miss Marple observed how Geoffrey avoided looking directly at Penelope, though the young woman kept her eyes fixed on him. An interesting triangle, she thought, considering that Margot Sinclair clearly saw herself as the future Mrs. Thornbury Hall. After breakfast, Miss Marple decided to take a walk in the gardens. It was bitterly cold, but she was warmly dressed in her tweed coat and hand-knitted wool scarf. She made her way towards the lake, where Sergeant Peters was standing guard with a bored expression. "Good morning, Sergeant. May I ask if you found anything else?" Peters, clearly relieved to have someone to talk to, was more talkative than he probably should have been. "The inspector believes it's all settled, ma'am. A simple accident. Although the town doctor mentioned something about marks on the deceased's wrists. He probably got them trying to break the ice when he fell." "Probably," Miss Marple agreed. "And did they find anything in their pockets?" "Just the usual things. Wallet, keys, a handkerchief, and a crumpled piece of paper with something written on it." The inspector didn't think much of it. What did the paper say? Peters frowned, trying to remember. Something like the mill. Midnight. I guess it was a business appointment or something. Miss Marple thanked the sergeant and continued her walk, her mind actively working. The mill. She had seen an old, abandoned windmill on the road to Thornbury Hall. Had Victor kept a secret rendezvous there the night he died? As he circled the lake, he noticed a solitary figure on the snow-covered pier. It was Dr. Price, smoking a cigarette and gazing at the water with a worried expression. "Dr. Price, what a surprise to find you here." The doctor turned around, startled, before putting on a forced smile. "Miss Marple, I was just thinking. This place has a certain atmosphere now, don't you think?" "Indeed. Tell me, Doctor, is it true that you found marks on Mr. Crane's wrists?" Price looked at her with renewed interest, as if he was seeing her for the first time. "The sergeant talks too much. But yes, there were marks. Circular abrasions, as if his hands had been tied with something. A rope, perhaps. And what about Inspector Hewitt?" "You think I imagined it? Or that Crane got them fighting the ice?" The doctor threw his cigarette to the ground and crushed it with his foot. "But I've seen enough injuries in my career to know the difference between desperate scratches and ligature marks." "So, you believe he was murdered?" Price looked at her for a long time before answering. "I think someone took Victor Crane to the middle of that lake, tied him up so he couldn't escape, and dropped him into the freezing water. I think he died, terrified, knowing exactly what was happening to him." Miss Marple felt a chill that had nothing to do with the January cold. "Do you have any idea who could do something like that?" Dr. Price looked towards Thornbury Hall, where the windows shone with warm light against the grey sky. Victor Crane had been managing this estate for 20 years. 20 years knowing this family's secrets. And in my experience, Miss Marple, old secrets are the most dangerous. Chapter 4. The obvious suspect. By midday, Detective Inspector Hewitt had changed his mind. The marks on Victor Crane's wrists, initially dismissed, had been confirmed by the county coroner as consistent with ligatures. What had been an unfortunate accident had officially become a murder case. The news hit Thornbury Hall like a second blizzard. Helena Ashworth, already weakened by her illness and the initial shock, had to be sedated again. The guests, who had planned to leave that morning, were informed that they must remain on the property until further notice. "It's absolutely outrageous," protested Margot Sinclair, pacing the drawing room indignantly. My father expects me to return to London tomorrow. I have social engagements that I cannot cancel. I'm afraid a murder takes precedence over social engagements, Miss, Inspector Hewitt replied coldly. Now, if everyone will be seated, I have a few questions. Miss Marple settled herself quietly in a corner with her knitting, seemingly absorbed in counting stitches, while her ears caught every word. I need to know everyone's movements during the party, Hewitt continued, specifically between 3 and 4 in the afternoon, which is when the coroner estimates the death occurred. Geoffrey was the first to speak. I was skating most of the time. Margot can confirm that. That's right, Margot agreed quickly. Geoffrey and I skated together for at least an hour. And you, Miss Hartington? Penelope blushed slightly. I was inside the house for a while. My head hurt, so I went up to my room to take an aspirin. Can anyone confirm that? No, I was alone. Hewitt jotted something down in his notebook with a meaningful expression. Miss Marple noticed Geoffrey looking at Penelope with barely concealed concern, and Reverend Whitmore. The clergyman cleared his throat nervously. I was talking with Dr. Price by the punch table. Then I went for a walk in the gardens. I needed a moment of solitude to reflect, alone. Completely alone, the questioning continued, revealing that virtually everyone present had had unwitnessed moments during the critical period. However, when it was the turn of the estate's gardener, a sullen man named Samuel Briggs, the atmosphere changed noticeably. Briggs was a man in his 50s, with enormous hands and a face weathered by decades of outdoor work. He had served at Thornbury Hall for 30 years, first under Helena's father and then under her late husband. Where were you between 3 and 4? Hewitt asked. In the tool shed, Briggs replied gruffly, sharpening the lawnmower blades. In January. Work doesn't wait, Inspector. We have to prepare for spring. Did anyone see him there? No, Hewitt leaned forward. I understand that you and Mr. Crane had a heated argument 2 weeks ago. Could you explain what it was about? A murmur rippled through the room. Briggs clenched his fists, his face flushing with anger. Crane wanted to fire me. He said I was too old, that I cost too much to maintain. He wanted to bring in someone younger, cheaper. After 30 years of loyal service, that must have enraged him. Of course, it made me furious. But I didn't kill him, if that's what you're implying. Do you have any proof of that? Briggs remained silent, his jaw tense. Miss Marple watched the scene with growing unease. The gardener had motive, opportunity, and certainly the physical strength to drag a man into the lake. He was the perfect suspect, almost too perfect. After the questioning, while the others dispersed in small nervous groups, Miss Marple approached the inspector. May I ask you a question, Inspector Hewitt? The policeman sighed with barely concealed impatience. Yes, ma'am. Have you investigated the abandoned mill? I understand Mr. Crane had a note mentioning that location. Hewitt frowned. How do you know that? Oh, one hears things, she replied vaguely. I was wondering if perhaps Mr. Crane was lured there before he was taken to the lake. With all due respect, ma'am, we have a suspect with a clear motive and no alibi. We don't need to complicate things with elaborate theories about abandoned mills. Miss Marple smiled sweetly. Of course, Inspector. I'm sure you're right. But as Hewitt walked away, she couldn't help thinking about Mr. Enderby of St. Mary Mead, a man who had been unjustly accused of stealing from the church collection. simply because he was in debt and had been seen near the church. The real thief, the respectable Mr. Thompson, had counted on everyone looking at the obvious suspect. Clever murderers, Miss Marple mused, always provided a convenient scapegoat, and whoever killed Victor Crane was undoubtedly very intelligent. Chapter 5. A hidden clue that afternoon. While most of the occupants of Thornbury Hall were resting or brooding over their worries, in private, Miss Marple decided to undertake a little expedition. Under the pretext of needing fresh air for her arthritis, she bundled up warmly and slipped out the back door of the kitchen. The abandoned mill was about a 15-minute walk away, following a path that skirted the edge of the birch forest. The snow crunched underfoot, and the silence of the winter countryside was almost absolute, broken only by the occasional caw of a crow. The mill had been an imposing structure in its glory days, but now its sails hung broken and crooked, and the stone walls showed deep cracks. The main door was ajar, swaying gently in the breeze. Miss Marple paused in the doorway, examining the snow-covered ground in front of the entrance. There were footprints, several of them, though the recent snowfall had blurred them considerably. Nevertheless, she could make out at least two distinct sets, some large, heavy footprints, probably those of a large man, and others smaller and more elegant. Carefully, he pushed open the door and stepped inside. The interior smelled damp and neglected, with cobwebs hanging from the beams like ghostly curtains. The dirt floor was covered in debris, dry leaves, and what looked like mouse droppings, but there was something else. In one corner, partially hidden under an old tarpaulin, Miss Marple found a rope. It was thick, the kind used for mooring boats, and had dark stains on it that could well have been dried blood. Beside it, half buried in the earth, was a gilt button with an anchor design. Miss Marple didn't touch anything. Instead, she memorized the exact position of each object and left the mill with her heart beating a little faster than usual. The button was distinctive, the kind of button that would adorn a good quality nautical blazer. She'd seen a similar one recently, she was sure, but she couldn't quite recall where. On his way back to Thornbury Hall, he encountered Reverend Whitmore, who was walking around the garden with a troubled expression. "Miss Marple, what a coincidence. I was just thinking about you. In me, Reverend. I've heard he has a certain reputation in his town, that he's helped resolve some delicate matters." Miss Marple smiled modestly. "Oh. I'm just a curious old woman who pays attention to small things." "The little things," Whitmore repeated. "Yes, I suppose it's the little things that reveal the big truths." He paused, gazing at the distant lake. "There's something I didn't tell the inspector. Something I perhaps should have mentioned. Yeah. The night before the party, I saw Victor Crane arguing with someone in the garden. It was late, past midnight. I couldn't see who he was talking to, but I heard snippets of the conversation." "What did you hear?" The Reverend lowered his voice. Victor was saying something about documents, about evidence he'd kept for years, and the other person, I couldn't tell if it was a man or a woman, replied that some secrets should remain buried. Victor laughed then, an unpleasant laugh, and said that burying secrets cost money. "Blackmail," muttered Miss Marple. "I'm afraid so." And then Victor said something else, something that has haunted me ever since. He said, "Old Ashworth thought he could take the truth to his grave. But I know what really happened that night." Miss Marple felt a chill run down her spine. "Old Ashworth. Helena's late husband." "That's right." Richard Ashworth died 3 years ago of an apparent heart attack. But if Victor knew something about that death, the implications hung in the icy air. Why didn't you tell the inspector about this? Asked Miss Marple. Whitmore rubbed his hands nervously. Because I have my own reasons for distrusting the police. And because I'm not sure who I'm protecting. This family has been generous to the church for generations. I don't want to destroy reputations based on snippets of conversation overheard in the dark. I understand your dilemma, Reverend. But a man has been murdered. And if Victor Crane was blackmailing someone, that person had a powerful motive to silence him. Whitmore nodded miserably. I know. That's why I'm telling you. Perhaps you can find the truth without destroying innocent people in the process. After the Reverend left, Miss Marple remained in the garden, thinking. Victor Crane had been a blackmailer, keeping secrets about Richard Ashworth's death. What had really happened 3 years ago? And who at Thornbury Hall had so much to lose as to commit murder? His eyes fell on the first-floor window, where a figure was gazing out at the garden. It was Helena Ashworth, pale as a ghost, looking down at the lake where her trusted steward had met his death, Miss Marple, then remembered where she had seen the gold button with the anchor. Geoffrey Ashworth was wearing it on his navy blazer the day of the party. Helena's son, the heir to Thornbury Hall, the man who had the most to gain if his father's secrets remained buried forever. Chapter 6. Confrontations and Secrets dinner that evening was a tense and silent affair. Helena Ashworth had insisted on coming downstairs, despite Dr. Price's protests, and presided at the table with a fragile dignity that seemed to require a tremendous effort. Geoffrey sat to her right, avoiding everyone's gaze, while Margot Sinclair chattered nervously about London trivialities that no one listened to. Miss Marple watched from her place next to Dolly, mentally cataloguing every gesture, every furtive glance, every prolonged silence. Penelope Hartington barely touched her food, pushing the peas from one side of the plate to the other with her fork. At one point, her eyes met Geoffrey's, and Miss Marple caught something in that exchange. A silent communication heavy with meaning that neither of them seemed to want others to notice. I have an announcement to make, Helena said suddenly, her voice surprisingly firm. I've decided to hire a private investigator from London. Inspector Hewitt seems convinced that Samuel Briggs is the culprit, but I've known Samuel for 30 years. That man is not a murderer. Mother, I don't think it's necessary, Geoffrey interjected. The police are doing their job. Their job is to arrest the most convenient suspect, not to find the truth. Victor was murdered on my property, at my party. I owe them at least the effort to find out who did it and why. Margot let out a nervous giggle. This is all very dramatic. Almost like a detective novel. The death of a man is not entertainment, Miss Sinclair. Helena replied with icy coldness. The ensuing silence was broken by the arrival of Martha, the cook, with dessert. As she served the apple pudding, Miss Marple noticed that her hands were trembling slightly and her eyes were red, as if she had been crying. After dinner, Miss Marple found an opportunity to speak with Martha in the kitchen. The cook was a robust woman of about 60, with rosy cheeks and an apron perpetually stained with flour. Excuse me for bothering you, Martha. I just wanted to thank you for dinner. The pudding was delicious. Martha dried her hands on her apron, avoiding looking at her directly. That's very kind of you, ma'am. I'm just doing my job. Did you know Mr. Crane well? The question provoked an immediate reaction. Martha put a hand to her chest, and her eyes filled with tears. Victor was... We were friends. Good friends, For many years. I'm very sorry. He wasn't a bad man, ma'am. People talk, they say things, but Victor had a good heart underneath it all. It's just that life had hardened him. Miss Marple nodded understandingly. Did he have enemies? Anyone who might wish him harm? Martha hesitated, twisting a corner of her apron. There are things I shouldn't talk about. Secrets that aren't mine to share. I understand. But one man is dead, Martha, and another may be unjustly accused of his murder. The cook looked towards the door, making sure they were alone. Victor kept documents, she whispered. Important papers in a safe in his cabin. He said they were his life insurance. That as long as he had them, no one would dare touch him. What type of documents? I don't know for sure. But once, when he'd had too much to drink, he mentioned something about old Mr. Ashworth's will. He said the original will was different from the one that was read after his death. Miss Marple felt that the pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fall into place. Different in what way? He didn't say it, but he laughed and remarked that Geoffrey wouldn't be so arrogant if he knew the truth about his heritage. Before she could ask any more questions, the sound of footsteps in the hallway interrupted them. Geoffrey Ashworth appeared in the kitchen doorway, his face clouded by something that could have been anger or fear. Martha, my mother needs her herbal tea. And you, Miss Marple, shouldn't you be resting? It's late for a woman your age. You're absolutely right, Mr. Ashworth, she replied gently. Old bones need rest. Good night, Martha. Thank you for the conversation. As she climbed the stairs to her room, Miss Marple reflected on what she had learned. An altered will, compromising documents, an estate manager who knew too much and had used that knowledge to his advantage for years. But something didn't add up. If Victor had blackmailed the Ashworth family for so long, why kill him now? What had changed? The answer, he thought, might lie in Helena's illness. With the matriarch dying, perhaps someone had decided it was time to cleanse the past before she could make revelations on her deathbed. Or perhaps Victor had made the mistake of asking for too much. Blackmailers, in his experience, often underestimated the desperation of their victims. That night, Miss Marple dreamed of frozen lakes and secrets buried under the ice, patiently waiting for the spring thaw to come to the surface. Chapter 7. Another Twister. Morning of the third day brought a revelation that shook the foundations of Thornbury Hall. Sergeant Peters arrived early with news that made Detective Inspector Hewitt pale. Samuel Briggs had been found unconscious in his cabin, with a deep head wound and an empty bottle of sleeping pills beside his bed. Attempted suicide, Hewitt declared with poorly disguised satisfaction. Guilt consumed him. It's practically a confession. Dr. Price, urgently called to attend to the gardener, had a different opinion. This man did not attempt suicide, she said firmly as she examined Briggs in the small makeshift infirmary. The wound to his head was inflicted from behind with a blunt object. Someone hit him and then administered the pills to make it look like suicide. Are you sure, Doctor? Absolutely. The angle of the wound is impossible to have been self-inflicted. Furthermore, there are defensive marks on his forearms, as if he had tried to protect himself from an attacker. Miss Marple, who had been watching the commotion from the stairs, exchanged a meaningful glance with Dolly. The real murderer was tying up loose ends, and Samuel Briggs had either come too close to the truth or knew something that made him a threat. This changes everything, Hewitt murmured, visibly upset. If Briggs is another victim, so the murderer is still at large in this house, Miss Marple concluded. The inspector looked at her with renewed respect, or at least with less condescension than before. Do you have a theory, ma'am? Just observations, Inspector. But I wonder if you shouldn't examine Victor Crane's cabin. As I understand it, he kept important documents there. Hewitt frowned. How do you know that? Oh, kitchens are wonderful places to eavesdrop on conversations. She replied vaguely. An hour later, the inspector returned from Crane's cabin looking puzzled. The safe had been forced open and completely emptied. Whoever had attacked Briggs had also taken advantage of the confusion to destroy evidence. The tension at Thornbury Hall became almost unbearable. The guests eyed each other with thinly veiled suspicion, and no one wanted to be alone with anyone. Margot Sinclair had developed a nervous tic in her left eye, and Penelope Hartington barely left her room. That afternoon, Miss Marple decided to visit Mrs. Clara Price, who had been curiously absent during recent events. She found her in the conservatory, watering some orchids with trembling hands. Mrs. Price, are you all right? You seem disturbed. Clara jumped, spilling water on her skirt. Miss Marple, you frightened me. I'm fine, just nervous. With everything that's going on. It's understandable. 2 attacks in 3 days. You start to wonder who will be next. Clara visibly paled. Please don't say those things. Miss Marple sat down on a nearby bench, pretending to admire the flowers. Did you know Mr. Crane well, Mrs. Price? Not especially. My husband treated him professionally, of course. Victor had heart problems, ironically. Edmund prescribed him medication, and you. Did you never speak to him privately? Something flashed in Clara's eyes, something akin to panic. Why are you asking me that? Just curious. It's just that I saw her talking to him during the party, before they discovered the body. It seemed like a pretty intense conversation. Clara dropped the watering can, which hit the stone floor with a loud crash. Did you see us? I have very good eyesight for my age, Miss Marple replied politely. What were you talking about, if I may ask? The doctor's wife slumped into a chair. All pretense of calm abandoned. You can't tell anyone. Please, my husband doesn't know. Nobody knows. Know what, my dear? Tears began to roll down Clara's cheeks. Victor was blackmailing me. 5 years ago, I made a terrible mistake. An indiscretion with a man who was passing through town. Victor saw me leaving the inn where we were. He's been extracting money from me ever since. Small amounts that I could hide from Edmund, but enough to ruin me. I understand. And what about the day of the party? He told me he wanted more, much more. He said he was tired of crumbs, and it was time to get a substantial sum. I begged him, told him I didn't have that amount. He laughed at me and said to find a way. What did you do then? Clara looked up, her eyes reddened but steady. Nothing, Miss Marple. I went back to the party and poured myself a glass of punch, and then Victor turned up dead. I swear I didn't kill him, but I can't say I'm sorry he's dead either. Miss Marple nodded slowly. Another victim of Crane's blackmail, another motive for murder. The list of suspects was growing instead of shrinking, but something about Clara's confession didn't add up. If she had been at the party when Victor died, who had taken him to the lake? Unless, of course, Clara Price was lying. Chapter 8. The final test. That night, while the house slept soundly, Miss Marple lay awake in her room, knitting and thinking. The needles moved rhythmically, but her mind worked even faster, intertwining threads of evidence as if they were different-colored wool. Victor Crane had been a blackmailer who extorted multiple victims. Clara Price was one of them, but clearly not the only one. The Reverend had heard mentions of documents concerning Richard Ashworth's death. Martha had spoken of an altered will, and the gold button found at the mill belonged to Geoffrey's blazer. But something didn't add up. Geoffrey Ashworth was the heir to Thornbury Hall, Helena's beloved son. Why would she risk everything to kill a man she could probably have bribed to keep quiet? Unless the secret was so devastating that no amount of bribery could guarantee its permanent concealment. The next morning, Miss Marple went down to breakfast early with a plan formed in her mind. She found Geoffrey alone in the dining room, drinking coffee with a haggard expression. "Good morning, Mr. Ashworth. May I sit with you?" Geoffrey made a vague gesture towards the chair in front of him. "As you wish, Miss Marple." She poured herself some tea and toast before speaking. "I've been admiring your blazer collection. That navy blue one with gold buttons is particularly elegant. An anchor design, if I'm not mistaken." Geoffrey tensed imperceptibly. "It's a gift from my mother." "Why do you mention that?" "Oh, just curious. It's funny how small details stick in your memory. For example, I noticed that yesterday he was wearing that same blazer, but it was missing a button on the left sleeve. The silence that followed was as dense as the January fog. "Buttons get lost all the time," Geoffrey finally said, his voice carefully controlled. "It happens, of course, although it's strange, because I found an identical button in the old abandoned mill." Next to a blood-stained rope, Geoffrey dropped his cup, spilling coffee onto the white tablecloth. His eyes, when they met Miss Marple's, were filled with something that could have been terror or fury. "What are you implying?" "I'm not implying anything, Mr. Ashworth. I'm just observing connections. You were at the mill the night Victor Crane died. The note in his pocket mentioned that place. Were you the one who arranged to meet him there?" "This is ridiculous. I'm going to call my lawyer. Of course, it's your right. But before you do, let me tell you a little story about St. Mary Mead. My village." Geoffrey stopped halfway up, caught by something in the old woman's tone. "There was a young man there," she continued, "the son of a respectable family, who discovered that his father had committed fraud years before. The estate manager knew about it and had been blackmailing the family for decades. When the father died, the young man thought the secrets would die with him. But the blackmailer had documents, evidence that could destroy the family name and the young man's inheritance. What does that have to do with me? Perhaps nothing. Perhaps everything. The young man in my story didn't kill the blackmailer, even though he had the chance. Instead, he was smart enough to seek help. He found the documents and destroyed them before they could cause any harm." Geoffrey sat down slowly, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I don't believe you're a murderer, Mr. Ashworth. I believe you went to the mill that night, yes. I believe you confronted Victor about what you knew, but I don't believe you killed him. So who did it?" Miss Marple looked him straight in the eyes. "That's what I hope you'll help me find out. What really happened at the mill?" Geoffrey remained silent for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. "Victor sent me the note. He wanted money, more than he'd been extracting from my mother for years. He said he had proof that my father didn't die of a heart attack. He said he was poisoned. Miss Marple showed no surprise. Continue. I went to the mill to negotiate. Victor was there, waiting for me. We argued. He wanted £100,000 to disappear for good. I told him I didn't have that kind of money. Things got violent, I admit. I pushed him, and he lost his balance for a moment. But when I left, he was alive. I swear on my father's memory. What time did you leave? Around 2:30. The party started at 3 o'clock. I went back to the house along the path, through the woods so that no one would see me, and you didn't see anyone else near the mill. Jeffrey frowned, as if trying to remember. There was someone. A figure on the path, walking towards the mill as I walked away. I couldn't see who it was. He was wearing a dark hooded coat. I assumed he was one of the servants. Miss Marple nodded slowly. Thank you for your honesty. Mr. Ashworth, I think I now know who killed Victor Crane. Chapter 9. Pieces of the puzzle. Miss Marple spent the rest of the morning in apparent tranquility, knitting in the drawing room while the other inhabitants of Thornbury Hall went about their busy routines. But behind her placid eyes, her mind worked tirelessly, sorting through every piece of information she had gathered. The hooded figure Jeffrey had seen walking toward the mill was the key. Someone else had followed Victor Crane that afternoon. Someone who knew about the meeting and had their own reasons for silencing him permanently. After lunch, Miss Marple requested a private conversation with Helena Ashworth. She found her in her study, surrounded by family photographs and mementos of happier times. Despite her frail health, Helena's eyes retained a remarkable sharpness. Miss Marple, Dolly has told me that you have some experience in these matters. Have you discovered anything about Victor's death? I've discovered many things, Mrs. Ashworth, but before I share them, I need to ask you some difficult questions. Are you willing to answer them honestly? Helena nodded slowly. At my age and in my condition, lies seem like an unnecessary luxury. Ask whatever you like. Did you know that Victor Crane was blackmailing you? A long silence followed the question. Helena closed her eyes momentarily, as if searching for strength somewhere deep within herself. I knew it. For the past 15 years, Victor has received regular payments that considerably exceeded his salary as an administrator, and the reason for the blackmail. My husband, Richard. Helena opened her eyes, and in them was an ancient sadness. Richard wasn't the man everyone thought he was. He had a violent temper that he masterfully concealed in public. During our marriage, I suffered years of cruelty that no one suspected. I am deeply sorry. The night he died, we had a terrible argument. Jeffrey was in London, thank God. Richard hit me, as he had so many times before, but that night something changed in me. When he collapsed, clutching his chest, I didn't call a doctor immediately. I just sat there, watching him die. It took me almost an hour to call for help. Miss Marple remained silent, without judgment. Victor was in the house that night, Helena continued. He had come to deliver some documents and overheard the argument. He saw everything through the study window. When Richard officially died of a heart attack, Victor came to see me with his proposal. Silence in exchange for money. And you accepted. What choice did I have? If the truth came out, Jeffrey would lose everything. Not just his inheritance, but the memory of his father. Richard, despite everything, adored his son. He was only cruel to me. Miss Marple pondered this information. Do you know if Victor was blackmailing anyone else in this house? Helena shook her head. Not for sure. But Victor was an observant man. In 20 years managing this estate, he must have accumulated secrets from half the county. One last question. Mrs. Ashworth, where were you between 2 and 4 o'clock in the afternoon on the day of the party? In my room, resting. Dr. Price had given me a mild sedative for my nerves. Martha can confirm that she brought me tea at 3 o'clock and that I was asleep. Miss Marple thanked Helena and withdrew, her mind processing this new information. Helena certainly had a motive, but she also had an alibi. Besides, in her state of health, she could hardly have dragged a burly man like Victor to the lake. On her way to her room, she ran into Penelope Hartington in the hallway. The young woman appeared to have been crying. Her eyes were red and her face was stained. Miss Hartington, are you all right? Penelope was startled. Miss Marple? Yes, I'm fine. It's just, all this is very difficult. I understand. These days have been terrible for everyone. May I ask you something? The young woman nodded hesitantly. You mentioned that you went up to your room during the party because you had a headache. Did you see anyone in the hallway? Did you hear anything unusual? Penelope hesitated, biting her lower lip. I heard footsteps. Someone coming down the service stairs, the ones the servants use. But I didn't see who it was. At what time approximately? It must have been around 3:15. I remember because the clock in the hallway was chiming. And weren't you curious to see who it was? I didn't want anyone to see me. She stopped abruptly. It doesn't matter. Miss Marple observed her with her penetrating but kind gaze. Miss Hartington, I think there's something you're not telling me. Something that's bothering you. Tears began to flow down Penelope's cheeks again. I can't, if I speak. I'll destroy someone I love. What if by remaining silent, you allow an innocent person to be blamed for murder? Penelope looked at her with pleading eyes. He didn't do it. I know he didn't. But if I tell what I know, suspicion will inevitably fall on him. Are you talking about Geoffrey Ashworth? Penelope's silence was answer enough. Chapter 10. The trap. Miss Marple gently led Penelope to a small private drawing room, away from prying ears. The young woman was visibly trembling, torn between love and truth. My dear, you must tell me everything, Miss Marple said with gentle firmness. Only the whole truth can protect those we love. Penelope slumped down on a sofa, twisting a handkerchief between her fingers. Geoffrey and I love each other, she finally confessed. We met 2 years ago at a party in London. His mother doesn't know. Nobody knows. She wants him to marry Margot Sinclair for her money. My family is ruined. I have nothing to offer except an old surname. And did Victor Crane know about their relationship? He found out about us 6 months ago. He came to see me privately and demanded money in exchange for his silence. I told him I had nothing, that my family could barely keep up appearances. He laughed and said, I'd have to find another way to pay him then. Miss Marple felt a shiver of understanding. Did he threaten her? Not directly, but his insinuations were clear. He said a young, beautiful woman always had something to offer. Penelope shuddered. Geoffrey doesn't know anything about this. If he found out, he'd do something terrible. Where was Geoffrey really during the party? You know, right. Penelope nodded miserably. He was with me in my room for an hour. He came up the service stairs while everyone was distracted by skating. That's why I couldn't tell the inspector the truth. If we confess that we were together, his mother will disinherit him. But that means Jeffrey has an alibi for the time of the murder. Yes, but no one will believe us. They'll think I'm lying to protect him. Miss Marple remained thoughtful. This information changed everything. If Jeffrey had been with Penelope, he couldn't have taken Victor to the lake. But then, who was the hooded figure he had seen walking toward the mill? Penelope, I need you to think carefully. Did you hear anything else while you were in your room? Voices, footsteps, anything? The young woman frowned, concentrating. Something happened. Around 3:30, we heard a noise downstairs, like someone had dropped something heavy. Jeffrey wanted to go down and investigate, but I asked him to wait. We didn't want to be discovered, and then, silence. Until we heard the shouts from the lake. Miss Marple stood up, her decision made. Thank you, my dear. It was very brave of you to tell me this. Now I need you to trust me. Tonight, I'm going to hold a small meeting in the main hall. I want everyone there, including you and Jeffrey. What are you going to do? I'm going to catch a killer. That afternoon, Miss Marple sought out Inspector Hewitt and explained her plan. The policeman, though skeptical, was desperate enough to consider any alternative. Samuel Briggs was still unconscious, and the case had reached a complete standstill. It's an unorthodox method, Hewitt admitted. But if you think it will work, I've seen similar methods work before, Inspector. Assassins, however intelligent, have an Achilles heel: pride. They can't resist the temptation to demonstrate their superiority when they feel secure. At 8 o'clock that evening, all the residents and guests of Thornbury Hall gathered in the main drawing room. Helena Ashworth, pale but resolute, occupied her usual place by the fireplace. Jeffrey sat near Margot, though his eyes kept searching for Penelope. Dr. Price and his wife Clara occupied a sofa, she visibly nervous, he with a professionally neutral expression. Reverend Whitmore stood by the window, and Dolly Bantry had settled herself next to her friend, curious but apprehensive. Thank you all for coming, Miss Marple began. I know these past few days have been difficult, and that you all want this terrible matter to be resolved. Are you going to tell us who killed Victor? Margot asked impatiently. Indeed, Miss Sinclair. But first allow me to reconstruct the events of that fateful day. Miss Marple walked slowly around the room, her voice clear and measured. Victor Crane was summoned to the abandoned mill by a note. There he encountered someone who had a score to settle with him. There was a confrontation, possibly violent, but Victor survived the encounter. So how did it end up in the lake? Asked Dr. Price. Patience, Doctor. Victor left the mill alive, but someone else was waiting for him. Someone who had followed his movements, who knew his plans, and who had a much more powerful motive than mere money to silence him. The tension in the room was palpable. Miss Marple observed each face, cataloguing every reaction. The killer tied Victor up, probably after rendering him unconscious, and dragged him to the middle of the lake, where the ice was thinner. Then he dropped him into the icy water, knowing he would die within minutes. But who? Helena exclaimed. Who would do something so monstrous? Miss Marple stopped, her eyes fixed on a specific point in the room. Someone who was being slowly destroyed by Victor Crane. Someone whose reputation, whose entire life, depended on keeping a secret buried forever. Chapter 11. The revelation, the silence in the drawing room was absolute. Everyone held their breath, waiting for Miss Marple's accusing finger to point at someone else. Anyone but themselves. Victor Crane was a despicable man, Miss Marple continued. For years he amassed secrets like others amassed wealth. He blackmailed Helena over what she had witnessed the night of her husband's death. He extorted Clara Price over a passing indiscretion. He threatened Penelope Hartington with revealing her secret affair with Geoffrey. Their eyes met, accusatory and surprised. But none of these people killed him, the old woman said. Each of them had a motive, yes, but they also had something to lose if they acted rashly. The real killer was someone whose situation had become unbearable. Someone for whom Victor had ceased to be a manageable nuisance and had become an existential threat. Miss Marple walked towards the fireplace, where the fire was crackling softly. I've learned something important in my years of observing human nature. The most brutal crimes are rarely committed by brutal people. They are committed by desperate people, people who feel cornered with no way out. For heaven's sake. Miss Marple, cried Margot, are you going to tell us who you are? Or will you continue with these endless digressions? Patience, Miss Sinclair. The truth deserves to be properly revealed. The old woman turned to face the group, her blue eyes shining with a piercing clarity. On the day of the party, Victor Crane received a note summoning him to the mill. He believed he was going to meet with Geoffrey Ashworth to negotiate a substantial payment. But the note wasn't sent by Geoffrey. It was sent by someone who knew Victor's movements, his methods, and his weaknesses perfectly, and who could possibly know all that? Asked Reverend Whitmore. Someone very close to him. Someone who had been his confidant for years, who knew every one of his dirty secrets because he himself had told them. Someone who finally decided that the only way to free himself was to eliminate him permanently. Miss Marple turned her gaze towards a particular corner of the room. Martha, could you come closer, please? The cook, who had stood by the door, as was customary during family gatherings, visibly paled. Me, ma'am. Yes, dear. I think she has something to tell us. Martha advanced with hesitant steps, her hands nervously twisting her apron. I don't know what you're talking about. I think she does know. You and Victor were more than friends, weren't you? You were lovers for many years. A murmur of surprise swept through the room. Martha lowered her head, unable to deny the accusation. He promised me we'd leave together, she whispered. He said that when he saved enough money, we'd leave this place and start a new life. But that was never going to happen, was it? No. Tears began to stream down Martha's cheeks. A month ago, I discovered that Victor had another woman, a widow in Much Benham. He'd been seeing her behind my back for years, promising her the same things he'd promised me. And when he confronted him, what happened? He laughed at me. He said I was a silly old woman, that I had never meant anything to him, that he had only used me to have eyes and ears inside the main house. Miss Marple nodded sadly, so he decided to get revenge. He wrote the note summoning Victor to the mill, mimicking Geoffrey's handwriting. He knew Victor would come, expecting to collect a considerable sum. But I didn't kill him, Martha protested. I only wanted to scare him, to show him that I could be dangerous too. I know, Martha. You're not the murderer. Another murmur of confusion swept through the room. Then who? Helena demanded. Miss Marple turned slowly, her eyes settling on another figure. Martha sent the note, but someone else seized the opportunity she unwittingly created. Someone intercepted the message, immediately grasped its potential, and followed Victor to the mill, waiting for the perfect moment to act. Who? Helena repeated. Someone who had been watching everything from the shadows. Someone whose profession gave him access to medications that could incapacitate a large man. Someone who knew the properties of the ice in that lake perfectly because he had grown up in this town. Miss Marple's eyes finally fell upon her target. Dr. Edmund Price. Do you have anything to say? The doctor, who had remained motionless throughout the revelation, slowly rose. His normally affable face had transformed into a cold mask. That's a very serious accusation, Miss Marple. It is. But it's also the truth. Victor Crane wasn't just blackmailing his wife, Doctor. He was blackmailing you too. Because he knew what really happened 15 years ago with Mrs. Henderson. His first patient at Thornbury Magna. The silence that followed was absolute. Chapter 12. Consequences. Edmund Price remained motionless for a moment that seemed to stretch on forever. Then, slowly, a bitter smile curved his lips. Mrs. Henderson, he murmured. After all these years, she still haunts me. Clara Price stifled a scream, bringing her hands to her mouth. Edmund, what are you talking about? My first big mistake, my dear. The mistake that Victor Crane turned into my life sentence. Miss Marple watched the doctor with a serene but attentive expression. Why don't you tell us what happened, Doctor? I think you've carried this burden for too long. Price slumped into his chair. All resistance abandoned. I arrived at Thornbury Magna 15 years ago, fresh out of medical school. I was eager to prove myself, to build a reputation. Mrs. Henderson was one of my first patients. She had severe abdominal pain, which I diagnosed as appendicitis. I recommended immediate surgery. But it wasn't appendicitis, said Miss Marple gently. No, it was an ectopic pregnancy. A diagnosis any experienced doctor would have recognized. But I was young, arrogant, too proud to consult a more experienced colleague. I operated on her myself at her home, convinced I was saving her life. And she died, Miss Marple finished. She bled to death on my makeshift operating table. Her husband was out of town. Victor Crane, who was then just a young assistant to the previous administrator, came to deliver some papers and witnessed everything. He helped me clean up the scene to make it look like Mrs. Henderson had died of natural causes in her sleep. And in return, Helena asked, her voice trembling, in return, I became his slave. For 15 years, I paid him a considerable portion of my income. I forged death certificates when he needed them. I looked the other way when his activities required medical discretion. I was his puppet, bound by threads of guilt and fear. Clara sobbed silently, her face buried in her hands. But something changed recently. Miss Marple continued. What was it? Victor became greedy. Regular money was no longer enough for him. He wanted a huge sum, enough to disappear with that widow from Much Benham. He gave me an ultimatum. £100,000 in a month, or he would go to the police with everything he knew. A sum that you could not raise. Impossible. I would have had to sell everything, including our house. Clara would have discovered the truth. My reputation, my marriage, my entire life would have been destroyed. Inspector Hewitt, who had remained in the shadows by the door, stepped forward. Dr. Price, are you confessing to the murder of Victor Crane? Price looked at the policeman with empty eyes. What's the point of denying it now? Yes, I killed him. I intercepted the note Martha sent and followed Victor to the mill. I waited until Jeffrey left, then I went in. Victor was surprised to see me, but he didn't suspect a thing. After all, I was his obedient creature. How did he do it? Hewitt asked, pulling out his notebook. I offered him a drink from my flask. I'd added a powerful sedative, enough to stun a horse. When he lost consciousness, I tied him with the rope I'd prepared and dragged him to the lake. The ice in the center has always been treacherous. I lowered him through an opening I'd made that morning before the guests arrived, and Samuel Briggs asked Miss Marple. Old Samuel saw me coming out of the woods that afternoon. He didn't say anything then, but after the investigation began, he came to see me. He said he'd noticed my shoes were wet, that he knew I'd been near the lake. He didn't accuse me directly, but his insinuations were clear. I couldn't risk him talking. Helena Ashworth stood up, her fragility momentarily forgotten. How could you, Edmund? I considered you a friend. I trusted you to take care of my health, of my family. And I did, Helena. For years, I took care of them all as best I could. But Victor had turned me into something I never wanted to be. Every day, every moment, I lived in terror that my secret would be revealed. When he gave me that ultimatum, something broke inside me. Inspector Hewitt approached with the handcuffs. Dr. Edmund Price, you are under arrest for the murder of Victor Crane and the attempted murder of Samuel Briggs. You have the right to remain silent. As the inspector recited the defendant's rights, Clara Price broke down in sobs. Geoffrey, overcoming his own shock, went over to comfort her. Penelope watched him from across the room, her eyes filled with a mixture of horror and relief. Miss Marple quietly withdrew to the window, where Dolly waited for her with a bewildered expression. Jane, how did you know? How could you see what everyone else was missing? It wasn't difficult, my dear. I simply paid attention to the details others considered insignificant. Dr. Price mentioned the ligature, marks before anyone else had publicly noticed them. He knew the properties of the ice on that lake all too well. And when I spoke with him by the dock, there was something about his description of Victor's death, a clinical precision that suggested first-hand knowledge. But Mrs. Henderson, how did you find out about her? An educated guess, confirmed by his reaction. Victor Crane had been blackmailing the doctor for 15 years. The secret had to be something devastating, something that would completely destroy his career. A fatal medical error was the most logical explanation. Outside, the police car waited to take Dr. Price away. Clara, supported by Reverend Whitmore, watched him leave with eyes that no longer recognized the man with whom she had shared her life. A week later, Miss Marple was packing her bags to return to St. Mary Mead. Peace had returned to Thornbury Hall, although it was a peace tinged with sadness and painful revelations. Helena Ashworth, paradoxically strengthened by the events, had announced her blessing for Geoffrey and Penelope's marriage. Margot Sinclair had returned to London, relieved to escape what she called that dreadful place. Samuel Briggs was slowly recovering, and Martha had been forgiven for her unwitting part in the tragedy. Will you visit us again, Jane? Dolly asked as she accompanied her friend to the car. Perhaps when the weather is warmer, my dear. Although I must admit that Thornbury Magna has turned out to be a more interesting place than I expected. Dolly smiled despite everything. Interesting is one way to describe it. Miss Marple looked out at the lake one last time. The ice had begun to melt, revealing the dark waters beneath. Soon, spring would bring new life to the garden, and the horrors of winter would become memories that would fade with time. But she knew that some secrets never completely melted away. They remained hidden beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to emerge. Human nature was like that, she thought as the car drove off along the birch-lined road, capable of great love and terrible cruelty often in the same heart. And somewhere, in some quiet village in England, another secret was waiting to be discovered.